All right, good to go.
Yeah.
Awesome. So yes, as Dr. Worlton said, I was very fortunate to be the first military fellow with the USU and Harvard collaboration. Nothing to disclose. So today, just talk a bit about what some of those opportunities are for many of you in the future between USU and the Harvard PGSSC collaboration, specifically in research, but then also in policy and education. And then talk, of course, about some of the applications of the program as well. So just a bit of background on me. I'm a USU grad. That's me on the bottom left. At our first spring break, we're going to space A out to Germany and ended up spending, that was when we were about to board our flight, which never took off. We spent 3 days in that terminal waiting for the space A that never left, and then ended up going home. So that was our first USU spring break there. I'm also an orthopedic resident. In the middle was my first case at shock trauma a couple years ago, and then in the top right is a patient who we cured of their metal deficiency. So this is Admiral Cullison. And the reason I share him, so back in 2013, when I went to USIS, I kind of had an inkling that I might want to do orthopedics. Also was super interested in global health. And I didn't really know at the time, how do I reconcile these two things? Is it kind of one seemed more primary care centric and one seemed like completely the opposite? And I wasn't going to have time essentially for one or the other, or the ability to do them. And luckily, he gave this lecture in 2013 just at a random lunch, and I must have been between things because I stopped into it. And it was all about his experience in Southeast Asia as a retired, well, he was a hand surgeon who was still active duty. He just retired at the time, so an orthopedic surgeon. And so back when I was trying to formulate a plan for my research year, I actually sent him just a cold, I found his email on the internet, and I emailed him, and he responded. And we ended up having a Zoom call. This was about 8 months before my research year began. And this was actually, I include this because this was what I formulated to him, was just saying that I was a first year at USIS and I went to this lecture, but I want to do something in this, but at the same time, I don't even know what this would look like. So he emailed some people who emailed other people, who emailed other people, and that's how I ended up speaking with Dr. Worlton and ended up having the experience that I had today. So just a bit on the PGSSC for those who aren't familiar. This is straight from their website. But briefly, just saying that surgery has largely been omitted from global public health discourse. And surgery, the objective here is to advocate for universal access to safe, affordable surgical anesthesia and OBGYN care when needed. So overall, their program is between 15 to 25 fellows, including 1 military resident a year, 5 to 10 medical students, and about 20 staff. So when I was going into this year, I knew I was going to do the program at this point, and I had two projects that were kind of put forth to me with my mentor at the program, Dr. Joseph, who was a orthopedic hand surgeon. So first was the Haiti earthquake review. So we'd be doing a scoping review that had already kind of been started on the 2010 Haiti earthquake response. I had very little background on Haiti. I was excited to jump into a project, but little background. And then the second would be something closer to home, so the impact study, which is a multi-centered project with the aim of developing an integrated framework into building trauma systems. So looking at military as well as civilian and how to leverage these two to fill gaps in trauma systems. So with Haiti, I started to dive in, and sure enough, just a month into my research year starting was when the earthquake happened in southern Haiti. And so when this happened, obviously this completely changed how we were working with partners down there. This obviously impacted them. We had people on our own team that were in Haiti at the time, since just like me, they were also remote there. So this made things a lot more personal with this project. And then what it also allowed for me to do, I'd never been a part of a response before, but a lot of this response, because of COVID and how things changed with Zoom, there would be Zoom calls a couple times a week led by the US Navy, with multiple different partners and NGOs that were there on the ground, with the Navy ship that was outside of Haiti, and with other University of Miami, other big partners in this, that would all be having these conversations. And this was something that, for me, I'm reading about doing the scoping review, reading about responses, but then real time seeing a response, and then also being able to help out Dr. Joseph with what we were contributing from up in Boston down to the response effort as well. So really, this was one thing that entirely shaped and changed how this year would be for me. And then the second thing that happened, which I'm sure many of you were a part of, was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was the 1 week where I was somewhat involved clinically, but which really we got to see again how a military and civilian both together, because as you all are very familiar, we had a number of civilians in our hospital. So watching military civilian teams working together and bringing patients back, and this is something, as you can see, that I dove into a bit later on. So diving into the, talking about the impact study a little bit and what it is. So in general, so the global burden of trauma, obviously the US military is actively involved with global health engagements with partner nations. This is why it matters to the US military. And then likewise, there's this massive burden of trauma, which we're all aware of, most of which is in lower and middle income countries. So we know that military systems exist in most countries that have militaries, and that likewise, though, they're not routinely leveraged for trauma care delivery. Having said that, we don't quite know what the proportions are at this time. So that's kind of where the first part of this study fits in, is finding out what these proportions might be so that we can see where we can fit in. And then we also, I think just an important thing to note is that when we talk about this as a spectrum, being from no integration to partial integration to full integration, which is defined in that top right of the slide. But when we talk about this, it doesn't mean that everyone's goal is to eventually become fully integrated. Every nation is going to have different levels of integration, which fits well for them. So more the aim of this study is to show these different types of integration that have been successful in certain countries, and then see if countries can leverage different ways to work with that. So just an example from kind of closer to home. So that's SAMC in the top left, obviously an integrated trauma. They take civilian trauma there. In the middle is the Comfort, I think, hopefully not the Mercy, one of the two. So one of our hospital ships, which obviously does civilian missions as well. And then you see Shock Trauma in the bottom left, which for those who have been there, have run into a number of our Air Force colleagues that are there full time through the Sea Stars program. So just examples of integration in the U.S. medical or military system. And importantly for us, there's no integrated frameworks that provide guidance on how to have military and civilian resources pooled together in order to improve trauma care. Thus, the final goals of the impact study. So therefore, we want to determine how civilian and military systems are currently collaborating with each other, determine what some of these common themes are for integration, and then finally, if these themes can be utilized to create a framework. So in 2022, last year, and even starting before that, we had two concurrent things which began, which I'll dive into a bit more, the case studies as well as our scoping review. And then the plan moving forward is to move into a quantitative, qualitative aspects, and then finally a pilot framework, hopefully in 2024. So the case studies, we had 7 different nations, as well as, or 5 different nations, and then 3 different partnerships, where we wanted to look at historical context, the reasons for their integration, the methodology and process of integration, lessons learned, and future directions. So this was with unique partners that we picked that were experts in their field, that were able to provide interviews, which were then looked at further, and which we were able to do analysis on. So this was overall how all of these countries kind of shaped up, if you will, as far as their integration levels. And I'll dive into this a bit more. So on the right, kind of on the far end of the spectrum, you see a country like Israel who's fully integrated. So looking at why that might be and how that is something that we kind of continue to do. But it's a country that has mandatory military service because of their geography and where their conflicts are. Oftentimes, they can leverage their civilian trauma systems in order to take care of military casualties, and then vice versa. Oh, sorry. And then also they because everyone has this mandatory military service, everyone has this very inherent knowledge of how the military works in Israel. Likewise, at the other end of the spectrum, Peru and South Africa, for various reasons, have almost no integration within their systems. And that works well for them, especially in Peru. And then likewise, there's partially integrated systems, which are at different levels of the spectrum. But in the US, Sri Lanka, Jordan, we see different combined medical schools. We see combined trauma hospitals like Shock Trauma or at BAMC. And then likewise, we see combined emergency training. Oftentimes, it's readiness training, which is being done in all these countries. We had some partnerships that we examined as well, specifically in the US and UAE, as well as Pakistan and UK, where we looked at military personnel with civilian providers or embedded in civilian trauma centers. So just talking about some of these themes that we already kind of hit on a bit, but just the shapers of why people are where they are on the spectrum. So a history of conflict was a common theme. Likewise, geography. Likewise, skill sustainment, a patriotic environment, senior level support, and fiscal concerns. And what we did see with a lot of these as well was that they were again seen in our scoping review, which we'll get to in a moment. So with our scoping review, this was over the course of about a year. We had over 8,000 studies that we ended up importing and including 76 total studies. What we were looking for with this was evidence of clear integration in these studies with military and civilian trauma systems. So, and I think it's important to add on that we had 4 medical students from USU that were directly involved in this, including an MS1 who was awesome. And then 6 Walter Reed surgical residents, 4 from the general surgery side and 2 from the orthopedic side. So overall, this was our big results, just looking at themes which we categorized. And you see 5 key themes that we found being skill sustainment, academic integration, geography, event-based integration, and likewise high-level government support. And we'll dive into a bit more of those now. So skill sustainment or readiness, which we defined as developing or maintaining skills needed for trauma care delivery for a ready military medical force. So oftentimes these were studies which were looking at the academic side and continuing to have skills that are sustained throughout. As people are frequently discuss that walker's dip when we're not in trauma, that we need to stay ready and that we need to maintain our skills. So looking at this one study as an example, this was from neurosurgery. I know the title talks a bit about residency training, but really that beyond part was kind of why this fits into the skill sustainment side. They talked about some of the neurosurgeons that are stationed out in San Diego and how they work embedded at UCSD in order to maintain readiness, especially in some of their trauma work. And what you'll see with this study as well, because you might think, well, this fits into other categories, and that's exactly right. So a lot of these have multiple themes that they might kind of overlap and be involved in. So academic integration was our next theme. So this was collaboration in an academic environment, promoting knowledge base through research in trauma, improving skills or care, and active educational programs. So we've all been a part of these. This one, obviously closer to home for me, it's an orthopedic database, which is enormous throughout the country. You can see all of the different sites that utilize it, both military and civilian sites, and which can leverage this data, because obviously if we use our military data for trauma, it's pretty small, but if we look at some of that data can be extrapolated from our civilian sites into our military sites. And when we all leverage our resources and our data, we can have huge numbers, and really has led to a lot of success in research, especially at least from this study, from the orthopedic side. Geography is also something which is super important. We talked about Israel a bit more and how they utilize their trauma systems. This is something that came up frequently. This study in particular was looking at helicopters in France that are military helicopters, which obviously their teams wouldn't have too much if they stayed, if there's not actively involved in the conflict, they wouldn't have too much to do, but they cover the search and rescue for these regions in northern France. Likewise, we saw this in the US with other helicopter teams as well. We saw this in Spain, and we saw this in other countries. So it's something that's frequently leveraged, these helicopter systems, in order to cover vast amounts of geography. Event-based integration is also something that we found as a theme. So this was using trauma resources or infrastructure in order to respond to a specific event with resulting casualties. We've mentioned Israel before. This was a study directly from them. You can see from this map on the bottom left that this is exactly how their geography kind of works to their favor, in that they can have their civilian medical systems take patients and casualties from close by. This study was actually looking at patients that were Syrian and not Israeli, that they were able to evacuate to. So Syrian civilians, they were able to evacuate and treat in civilian Israeli hospitals. And then finally, high-level government support is imperative. So this was integration or collaboration fostered by state or provincial or national level government bodies through means including funding, legislation, or logistical support. And these were all super critical, not only to these missions getting off the ground, but then also being sustained. This was an orthopedic article again, But this was also seen in non-orthopedic treatment as well, where we looked at different international events and what led to some of their success. So with this specifically, high-level government support was critical for having some of these teams go overseas. So this is a bit of an infographic, which has both some of the results from the case studies as well as from the scoping review. What you see is the case studies ones are all that are listed here, but then the scoping review have these boxes around their 5 themes as well. And there's a couple of stars next to both high-level government support and financial considerations. And that's because some of these can be, obviously, the high-level support, of course, is a facilitator when it occurs, but likewise, it can be a huge barrier when it's not something that is given or provided, or when that support goes away. And vice versa with financial consideration. While it's a huge barrier when there's no funding, consistently we found that when there's no financial support, usually from these high government levels, Congress even, that it's a barrier. But also when it's provided and it's sustained, that can be a facilitator for this. Overall, this was just showing what our different levels of integration were. So coordinations being about 18% and collaborations being 50%. And then some of those other ends of the spectrum, partial and full integration, about 35%. And then most importantly, and I think this is the kind of the key and why we're doing what we're doing and pushing forward, is the authorship and location of studies by income status. So we can see that overwhelmingly from all of these manuscripts that we reviewed, almost all of them are from high-income countries. And then I think the other thing that's super important that jumps out is when we see the low and middle income countries column there, we see that there were 16 studies that were done in low and middle income countries, but that the affiliations were only 3 from those countries themselves, which means presumably that a lot of these studies that might have been done in lower and middle income countries didn't have any authorship from those countries themselves and weren't representative of those countries themselves, and mostly came from high-income countries. So overall, this is our goal, is to build these equitable bilateral partnerships with diverse representation, and then frameworks driven by nations where the transformation is taking place. And again, just going back, I think this is the key, especially in that middle of that bar there, just showing why we're doing that. So we're now at the phase of the study where we're trying to engage some of our partner nations, and that's what the links here and that QR code there are for our partners to engage, so that we can speak with them and have them partake in our survey, so we can move forward with their impact. So obviously it's a great year, but you will get some production out of it as well. These were a couple presentations that I was able to do. I think Ahmad's been fortunate enough to not have to wake up at 3 in the morning to give these presentations on Zoom in Zambia and India, and perhaps be able to travel instead. And then likewise too, from the publication standpoint, I've been really lucky to be able to have some of this be out there for other people to read as well. So I think not only has it been a great year experience-wise, but also it's something that you will get some production from as well. And then I think it's important too, because that year helped kind of shape me going forward, right? So this was a study that I now was able to design myself and I'm putting forward. So we've got, it's an orthopedics study, unsurprisingly, but we essentially wanted to see our solutions to the global burden of trauma of orthopedics represented in recent literature. So again, looking at how the global burden of trauma is overwhelmingly in lower and middle income countries, but yet is there authorship and solution equity in these? So are we coming up with solutions to orthopedic trauma that only really suits this very small percentage of the global pie, if you will? So we've done a similar, a huge review of publications from the top 10 H-index journals and pulled various demographics, including their financials. So where the studies were funded by and where the countries, where the hospitals were that they took place in. Likewise, we looked at appointments. So who are the authors, the first and last authors especially, as well as their gender. And then we also looked at country of data origin as well. So I think what we expect, and we've just finished our review, and we are just kind of getting some of our results back early. I think they're fairly unsurprising in the kind of huge discrepancies between how overwhelmingly all this literature is from high-income countries and not really helpful necessarily for some of our lower and middle income countries that make up the majority of the burden of trauma, especially in orthopedics. This program also, you'll be able to involve yourself in other things as well. My other goal for this last year, obviously global surgery was the one piece of it, but also getting involved in anti-racism work was a huge thing for me. And I was fortunate that this already existed because of the ties so inherent between colonialism and how the global health and global surgery is. And so there's already great work that was being done at the PGSSC that I was able to jump right into, including the anti-racism curriculum, which you can see in the top left, which is a specific curriculum in anti-racism for surgical residents. This is from an ACS grant that we were just able to pilot at 4 places over in Boston area over this last year, and hopefully we'll be going much larger in the next year. In the bottom left as well I was able to do my own anti-racism curriculum for our orthopedic interns during our block, presented on this in some research, and then as well had an invited talk in the bottom right back at the PGSSC most recently this year. You'll get to do some work in policy as well. I was lucky to be able to go to the embassy in Peru and get to meet with their vice president, seen here. Oh my God, I said, yeah. And meet Atul Gawande as well, which you can see here. He just had a meeting that was coming right after ours. So you'll get to do some very lucky experiences there. And I said Peru, I meant Ecuador. But yeah, so you'll get to do some really cool things in this way. And then finally, some other involvement. So, UGHE, which is one of our partners with the PGSSC, has over the last year really, I've been lucky to be able to be involved with some of their orthopedics. So I gave 4 different lectures this last year, and they've got this great mentorship program that they're getting off the ground. So I'll be able to stay involved with that as well. So from the educational side, you get a ton of that opportunity as well through the PGSSC. So overall, I think that the things that I found were to set goals and revisit them on regular intervals, because there's so much going on, especially during your research year, that it's important to have these big goals up front and then kind of continue to come back to them, or else it's easy to get distracted and kind of veer off course. Likewise, to find dedicated, supportive mentors and then to listen to them. This is something that I was so lucky, especially, Dr. Worrelton, to kind of have her there and be able to provide advice. And I just did everything she said. And then finally, placing experience ahead of production. I think that the production comes later, and the experience is the key, and just kind of allowing things to unfold as they should was kind of the best thing for me. So thank you all, and special thank you, of course, to Dr. Worrelton and to Ahmad for all of their help with me over the last 2 years.
Thank you.